Hi, and welcome to RESTful Sencha Ext JS. Today we're going to be using Node.js for a REST server with MongoDB, Sencha Architect version 2.2, and the Sencha Ext JS 4.2 framework to create a desktop application. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, my name is Christopher Rhodes. I'm a senior technical trainer here at Sencha, and I presented this at Silicon Valley Code Camp and Web Unleashed. So I'm excited about sharing it with the rest of the Sencha community. So here are our desktop application requirements. We're going to create a simple administrator application that's going to allow our administrator to see all of the active and inactive users, the ability to add new users, the ability to edit users, and the ability to delete users, all using a RESTful endpoint. Our RESTful endpoint is going to be built on top of Node.js. In order to satisfy the dependencies, you'll need npm if it's not automatically installed with your distribution of Node.js for your platform, and you'll also need MongoDB. For Mac users, you can install all of these dependencies using Homebrew. For Windows users, you'll need to satisfy the dependencies using the binary distributions for the installer of your choice. And if you're on Linux, you should be able to use the package manager with the distribution of your choice. Alright, first thing is to clone the repository. You can find this on GitHub. It's clrodes/restful-sencha, and you can go ahead and copy that link and clone the repository. This repository does include both the Node.js server along with the RESTful Desktop Admin completed application and the RESTful Admin mobile application. So first things first, we'll need to satisfy the dependencies. So you'll want to use npm install to go ahead and have the dependency satisfied and bring in all of the node modules for Express as well as the connector for MongoDB. Next, we'll need to initialize the MongoDB database. You can use the -p option if you're on a Mac or Linux to go ahead and create the subdirectories, and then we're going to use the db path option to point it to the data DB directory underneath our RESTful admin server. Okay, to start the node server, you'll use npm start, and by default the server will automatically populate the test database with an initial data set, so we will be able to see data prior to designing our application. To see the list of users, you'll want to go to localhost port 3000/users. CORS is enabled for this application inside of the node server. If you want to look up the Wikipedia article on CORS to find out more about cross-origin resource sharing, then it's highly encouraged if you haven't already seen CORS in action before. But because we were going to be running our application on localhost port 80 and our RESTful endpoint is a Node.js server on port 3000, it's a separate port, and therefore the browser considers it to be a separate domain, and it will not allow it to, by default, communicate over a different port. So we have enabled CORS inside of the REST application. You can dive inside of the app.js file in the RESTful admin node code to find out more about how the headers are sent to the application, and it gives the browser permission in order to communicate with the RESTful methods using POST for creating records, GET for retrieving records, PUT for updating records, and the delete method for deleting records. It's highly recommended also that you install the extensions JSON View. This extension exists for both Chrome and Firefox. To design our application, we are going to be using Sencha Architect. It is a WYSIWYG editor, so what you see is what you get. It's excellent for prototyping HTML applications, both desktop and mobile. Makes it easier and faster. It's drag and drop componentry for designing user interfaces. Model and data validation and verification against the RESTful endpoints from inside of Architect. So we can go ahead and validate that our model, if you've worked with XJS before, you may know that the model is one of the harder things to get configured, especially with getting the proxy enabled and also configuring the stores for multiple records. We can do all of that from within Architect to verify our data before we actually launch the application inside of the browser. There's also a display of all of the events that are bound to the components, and we do not have to go to the Sencha documentation site in order to get documentation. It's automatically provided for us inside of Architect for most of the componentry and the config objects. Last but not least, Architect does provide seamless integration with both frameworks for XJS and Sencha Touch. So it will download the version of the framework that you are going to be using for the desktop or mobile versions. It will also provide seamless upgrades as new versions of Architect come out and new versions of the framework are released. Okay, so enough on the PowerPoint slide for now. We're going to go ahead and get started with the actual code. So I have Sencha Architect version 2 already open here, and we're going to be creating a desktop application using XJS version 4.2. Okay, just a brief overview of the Sencha Architect interface, and then we will dive right into getting the functionality of our application completed. All right, so first of all is the toolbox. This is where all of the componentry as well as the data options and objects are kept. Here we can actually get access to any of our componentry. So let's say that we want to find a button. We have different styles of buttons and toolbars inside of XJS. We can go ahead and search for that. You can click on everything and that will search all of the componentry that's available within the entire framework. If you know what you're looking for, you can actually click on the subcategories here. So if we're working with forms, then we would need a form panel. We would also need a text field, more than likely, as well as buttons in order to add, save, and edit and delete to our application, as well as drop down, which would be the combo box. Time field and the date fields are also all here available in underneath the forms subcategory. If we're working with grids, then we can click on the grids and we'll see the different individual columns as well as the main grid panel that we'll be working with inside of our application. So that's the toolbox. Here is our canvas inside of design mode. We're going to look at the code here in just a moment. Right now we don't have anything on the code, so we will show the code as we get into creating the event handlers. Lastly is the project inspector. This is the MVC representation, so model view controller of our application as we create it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to need inside of our application is a viewport, and this manages the full height and width of our application and also manages the resize events should the user resize the window. For our application, we are going to be doing a full screen grid, so we're going to go ahead and set the value of the layout for the viewport to fit so that it will hold, so that the grid will take up the entire space of the browser window. And now if we look inside of the code view, you'll see that we have defined, at this point it's still my app.view.myViewport. It extends from the container viewport and it's a type of layout fit. So let's go ahead and name our application to something that's more intuitive. We're here inside of the config field, and this is where once we select something inside of the project inspector, we're given all of the individual configs for our application. So I'm going to go ahead and change this over to RESTful Admin Desktop. If you'll notice, now the name of our application inbound has now become RESTful Admin Desktop. We also have the initial view as my viewport. And if we go back to my viewport, we're going to go ahead and change this because this is actually the main view. We're going to go ahead and change the name of my viewport to main. Now you'll see that that updates inside of the code. So now we have RESTful Admin Desktop view main, and then in design mode, we still have our blank canvas. Here's a perfect place, now that we've got our naming convention for our application saved, we would actually save our application at this point. I'm going to go ahead and point this over to my htdocs folder, and the project name is still going to be RESTful Admin Desktop, which will be the XDS file or the Sencha Architect file that will store all of the metadata for our application. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that out. We could go ahead and take a look at the application. It's just going to be a blank window. So here's the default URL for our application. I have mine set up for localhost, RESTful Admin Desktop, app.html. So now we have the window and we have the viewport defined, but we have nothing on the viewport at this point in time. So go ahead and close this out. We will go ahead and populate this with an actual view, and then we will link that to the model and the store, and we will complete the functionality of our application. So let's go ahead, and we want to grab a grid panel and drop that onto the canvas. Just for the display purposes, it's already pre-populated with some values. We will link this up to the model and have the actual values of our application in there here in just a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and name this panel to be users. Now I'm going to go ahead and link our data. If you haven't already taken a chance to look at the data set, now is the time to do so. Go ahead and bring up the data set and show it. Again, I do have the extension for JSON view installed. So you'll see that this is a MongoDB dataset where we're using underscore ID, primary key, username, password, first name, sign up date, and enabled. So there is our data set. So the first thing that we need to do in order to populate the grid and to also have access to our RESTful endpoint is to define a model with a proxy. So the model is what stores the one-to-one data relationship. The proxy is how we retrieve the data over the wire, and the method by which we retrieve it. In this case, we'll be using REST. And then we'll also be using a store, which is a collection of the instances of a model. So we'll go ahead and grab model. And we could grab this from here, or we can come over to the project inspector and we can just choose model, go ahead and work with it. So either way, drag and drop from the toolbox or using the project inspector plus bar and create the model. By convention, a model is typically named a singular version of what we are accessing as far as a record. So in this case, we're accessing a user record. The name of our class, if we look inside of the code view, would be RESTful admin desktop model.user. The next property that we need to add on here is the list of fields for the data set that we will be using and populating for records that already pre-exist, or as we save the record back to the server over the proxy. We want to come down here to fields and click the plus sign, where first thing our primary key is going to be underscore ID. Our ID property is also going to be underscore ID. And then we would continue to add additional fields. So we can go ahead and add in first name, which is camel case, and you'll see that it populates the fields inside of the code. We could do this by continuously pushing plus, but if you'll notice the text is enter one or more field names. So these are separated by a comma. So we're going to go ahead and add in the rest of the fields. So that would be last name, that would be enabled, sign up date, and let me make sure that I did not miss one of the other records. Yes, username and password. Of course, we need that for users. Okay, so again, click on the plus for the fields, and then we can add both fields. So username and password, because we will be sending the password back to the RESTful web service. Okay, so now our fields are defined. Those match up directly to what we have inside of our data set. The order of which our JSON data is represented does not matter with the order of which the fields are listed inside of here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and add in the REST proxy. So we'll come down here and we'll go to the proxy, click the add button beside it, choose REST proxy. Okay, so you'll see that the proxy config with the type of REST has now been configured. And now we'll need to configure our proxy to use the URL for our RESTful endpoint. Click on the proxy arrow and that'll take us down to the My Proxy. From here we can find the URL config. So we'll just use the filter property URL. Our endpoint is going to be HTTP localhost 3000/users. We have to also tell our proxy some unique properties about our data set that may not be apparent in the beginning. First of all, what type of data are we reading back? Of course, with REST, traditionally, that value is going to be JSON data, but we also have some specific properties that we were bringing back, because if you'll notice, our data objects for each one of our records is actually nested inside of this data array object. So we need to tell the proxy to look not at the root object, but actually at the internal data array object for our record set. To do that, we're going to create a reader, and that reader is going to be a type of JSON. And then again, we'll use the arrow, or we can click on the MyJSON reader property here. See the root property. And so the root property that we're going to be looking at is data. Okay, so now this tells our model proxy is REST. That's how we're going to retrieve the data. We'll use get for reading, post by default for creating a record, put for updating a record, and delete for deleting a record. When we're reading the data, we are reading it as type of JSON, and then the root property that we're looking for our record set is inside of the data array object. Okay. Now there's also the property providing a writer here, but by default, the way that the reader is defined is the way that the writer will write the data back to the endpoint by default. So now we have our model configured, a way of being able to store multiple instances of our model records. In order to do that, we're going to need to define a store, or a store is a collection of models. We're going to use a generic store here. So again, we could come over to our data, or we could grab the store from our toolbox and then drag it over, or we can use the project inspector property and click on store, and then we want to use a base store. So we'll just click store one more time. By convention, the store is named plural to the model that it's associated with. In our case, our store is going to be our user's store, and then we'll need to attach the model definition to our store. So that is going to be a model. You'll see that it's already pre-populated since we've created the model of user. This will load the data. There's two different ways of being able to load the data inside of the store, inside of XJS. You can either call the load method manually, or we can configure the property of auto load. And since we're going to be displaying the records to our admin by default, we want to go ahead and enable auto load. So you'll see that that configuration is now done. So we have auto load set to true. We've defined our model, and now we want to give our store ID the same name as the name of the class. Go ahead and rename the store ID to also be users. So now that we have this, you'll notice that there's a little I that is actually popped up over on the right hand side next to the user store now that we've attached the model. This will actually display the data. This tells us that we are actually successfully loading data records inside of our store. So we haven't even configured this and added it to the grid yet, but yet we can see that our records are coming back as we expect. Okay. Now there are a few things that we need to take into consideration here, and this is performance, but also to take a date. In this case, this is coming back as the standard MongoDB date, but we also want to be able to display this perhaps in a different format. My favorite is a 4-digit year, 2-digit month, and 2-digit day. So I want to be able to convert this and not even worry about the time. If this convention, this is actually a type of C, 8601 date. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to go back to the model configuration, and I'm going to look up sign up date. What I'm looking for is the date format. I'm going to add that as a type of C. And then I also need to convert this because this is not a text field. It's not auto. So I want to convert this over to being a date field type. So in this case, I'll go down, find the type, and then I want to tell it that it's a date. Also, enabled is a special type as well because it holds true or false for active and inactive records. We want to convert into a type of Boolean. Okay, so now we have our enabled Boolean, we have our sign up date and type and C, and the rest of these we can leave alone. It's typically we could define these types as string. By default, that's going to call .toString for each field inside of our application, which can be a huge performance hit. So it's best, if necessary, to leave these as type of auto. So I'm going to go ahead and save the model while I have the opportunity. And then because we have configured these types and we configured the store, we can now link that store to our grid panel. And you'll see that it's automatically populated. So now we have the user store, and we've attached that. So now the store is pointing to our in XJS, stores are global. So we're pointing it to the user store. So when it loads, it will automatically populate these fields. And then what we can do now that we have the grid panel and we have attached the store, we can right click, can use a property config called auto columns. And what this will do is actually create the individual columns and assign the appropriate X type. For instance, here is our X type for date column, and here we have our Boolean column. All of these are mapped to data index matches back to the model field itself. So if we come over here, you'll see that the view has now changed, and now we can rearrange this. For instance, we may not want ID. More than likely, we would want to see the username first, and then first name, last name. And enabled, we can also configure this. There's for Boolean column, there's a true text and a false text. So the faulty value by default is false. So we're going to put no, they're not active, and then we're going to put yes, that they are active. Okay, if they're set for true. For sign update, we'll go ahead and put space there. And then we will, since this is a date column type, we can also specify a date format. This is the format that I like to prefer. We do not want to show the passwords. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Now, to make sure that our columns span out the full width of our application, I'm going to go ahead and set the default flex value. And flex is just a ratio, so I'm click the lock, so that now as I click through each one of these fields, you'll see that it brings me to just that flex value. So this makes it easy for me to update multiple configs. So now I can do one, or actually, yeah, do one. Did I did two there? I want to do one. Okay, one again. And then finally for the sign update. Our data actually spans the entire width of the viewport and the grid panel itself. Alright, so go ahead and save this out. So now we can actually see the data. So I'll go ahead again and open up the application. So again, that is RESTful Admin Desktop app.html, and you can see in the browser that it takes up the full span of the web browser. Okay, so we're displaying all of our data, and we've got that inside of a grid. So the next thing to do is to give the user the ability to edit and to create users and to delete them, so that now we've gotten part of our CRUD operations. So we've got the get portion because we're reading the data back using the RESTful proxy. Now we will complete the rest of the functionality. First things first, we're going to go ahead and add in a toolbar inside of our grid panel. And it's going to be docked automatically. This is the flyout menu to the top. And then inside of here, we want to add in a button to create a new user. Okay, and then the next thing that we'll want to do is create a window form that we're going to make modal in order to allow the user, the administrator, to update and to create new records. We'll go ahead and come over to our toolbox, and we're going to select window, and we can drag it over to views. And then you'll notice that because of a window is outside of the normal flow, then it is actually a part of it creates its own canvas that's separate, and we'll need to modify a couple of the configs. So first thing we're going to want to modify is this. We're going to call it the user form. We're going to rename this class into user form window, and then we will want to drag on a form panel in order to hold our fields, and the form panel comes with special properties that we'll see here in just a moment. So we'll go ahead and drag that on. We'll want to set the layout once again for our user form to be fit so that the form panel takes up the entire height and width. And then we don't need to panel labels, so we'll just go ahead and remove this, and notice that the form panel title bar actually is hidden when there's not a value already set. Okay. So next thing we're going to want to do is add in our fields for our individual data points. By default, and for most of these, this is going to be the text field, except for the Boolean, where we'll just make that into a checkbox for enabled or disabled. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and search, and we'll find text field. And then we could drag and drop these over multiple times, and it will stack. But we can also go over here into the project inspector and just choose duplicate. So we've got username, we have password, we have first name and last name. A sign up date will be populated on the server side. The last part that we will need is the checkbox. So let's just go ahead and bring that over. Okay, we don't need a label for that, so we'll left align, and then we can just put active. And then for each one of these, we will go ahead and give them the label value. And if you do not like the field separator, so for the colon here, you can actually remove that. That is a property that we can modify. So label separator. So if you wanted to, we could put on the lock, and modern design, we can just go ahead and remove the label. And now we are going to need to add in another toolbar, and we're going to dock it to the bottom down here to hold our function buttons for save, cancel, and delete. So we'll go ahead and drag in a toolbar. We want to dock it to the bottom. Go ahead and add in our buttons for that. So buttons, so we'll need one for save, we'll need one for cancel, and then we'll need one for delete. So you can go ahead and do this. So that would be that. And cancel, and then delete. And because of these being so close together, one of the UX and UI practices is to move the delete over to the far right. You can do that by using one of the properties inside underneath views, and then you'll see a fill with an arrow pointing here. And we can drag that over in between our cancel and delete buttons, and this will now fill in the space between the cancel button and the delete button. This window is tall, so we'll go ahead and change the height of the user window. Right now it's set at 250. I think we can get away with 220. Yeah, that looks much better. Or maybe even 210. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now we have our window configured and we have our form. Now we need to be able to link this for when the user creates an action, double clicking on the row or clicking on the new window to create a new record. One of the properties of the window is, as I mentioned before, making it modal. And what that means is that by default, when the form or the window is instantiated, then it will block actions from behind it, and it will put over a filter for all of the UI behind it, and it will be the front and center of our application. So I'm going to go ahead and change that property as well on the window, and that's modal. Check. And then also by default, when we instantiate the window, we do not show it by default. So there programmatically we can send auto show, or we can call the show method. I'm going to go ahead and default this to auto show, so that when we call the create method, it will automatically show the user window. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this linked in with our grid. But first of all, we'll go ahead and save our progress, and then we'll go back to our grid view. We'll click on our new user button. We're going to assign our first event to be a click event. So you'll find event bindings, and then this shows all of the individual events that are available on a button. Here again, we're going to use the click event, and this will automatically create a method that's named. I like these into more intuitive, so I'm going to say on save button click will be the name of our function. And we can actually look at the code behind here, and we can see that inside of our full flow, at the very bottom, this actually has created the on save button click function. Callback is getting the button, the event, and the event options. So we will do var when equals ext.create RESTful admin desktop .view .user form window, and then we will look at our code from our user's perspective, and we'll see that we have RESTful admin desktop.view.userform window on the save button click method, and now we can save our application and we can test. And so now we see that we've got a toolbar, and we can click on U and the user form pops up, and it is modal, and the user can drag the window around, and then now we can start populating the form. So we need to implement the save, cancel, and the delete functionality. And we need to also enable this same property for populating the form when the user double clicks on a row. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and populate the form first with pre-existing data, and then we'll work with the save method and the delete method on the model. On our grid view, we want to add another event binding. We could use either the double click, which is item double click, or we could use item click, so either single or double. So let's just go ahead with single click and use item click. This will give us back the data view, which is the grid itself, the record, the item, the index that it is inside of the store, the event, and the options. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and I'm going to change this to a better name. So on users grid item click. We also want to get access to the window, so we're going to do another ext.create. And again, it'll be RESTful admin desktop.view.user form window. So we'll use the same window for creating and updating. And then now that we have access to the window, we wanted to say when.down to the form. We want to call a property that is on the form panel called load record. Then we can pass in the instance of our model record. This will go ahead and set the values of our form once we link the data values for the name property with the data values for the model. So let's go ahead and do that. So go back into design mode, we'll go back into our user form window and into our form. For each one of the fields, we need to map those to the value that they are inside of the model in order for the load record property to work. So again, I'm going to use name. I'm going to go ahead and set the lock value. So I'm going to click on the field, and then I want to change the name value, so username, and you'll see that it changes here inside of Project Inspector. So this one would be, of course, password. Then we want to set first name to the camel case first name, last name, active maps back to enabled. Another property that we need to set is, because the password right now it is set as a value of a text field. You can actually go look at the code and you'll see that it says text field. We want to hide the value of the password. In this case, we can remove the lock, but then we want to change the type of the text field. This gives us the input type property value. We want to say that it is a password type, and you'll see that the input type is now password. So now as the user types inside of this, it will actually hide the value. So we'll go ahead and save this out, and then we will test. So go ahead and refresh, and we'll double click on a record. And as you can see, we're now populating, just because we've mapped the fields to the same value as the model and we're calling load record. Now we have our first name, our last name. We can see that they're active, and then let's see what happens if active changes. If we click on no, see that the value, since it's a Boolean value, it changes it to an unchecked value for the active state. We have the X, we cancel. We need to go ahead and add in the save functionality and then also the delete, and we're going to do this on a one-to-one basis using the model. Probably the easiest thing first is to enable the cancel. We're going to go ahead and go back to our user form window, and we can go into design mode and then click cancel. And then we want to add in another event, and once again this is going to be a click event. We're going to change the name of the function to say on cancel button click. Go into this function, and we can call button.up to window. We can call the .close method. Okay, and then we'll save that. We will test. So we double click cancel, and it destroys the window. Alright, save and delete is not too much more work than what we've already seen, so let's go ahead and create another event on the save button, and this time we'll be working with the model. Go ahead and add in another click event, Again, change the name to on save button click. We want to get access to the form, so we can do that by doing button up to form. Then we want to get access to the record, and we also want to update the record for any values that have changed. We can go ahead, actually using just the form, we can call form.update record because the record has already been set. Then we can go from the form up to the window once again, and now we can close it. So let's see how that works. So go ahead and save it, and then we'll test. Okay, we'll just put this as Quan, and then we'll click save. You'll notice the value inside of last name has actually changed, but it's showing at this point the record is considered to be dirty. So that's the UI indicator. The record has not actually been committed yet. So we actually haven't saved this data back to the server. We've only updated it on the client side. So we actually still need to get access to the record and then save it back using the proxy, which is going to use the put method. Okay, so let's see how to do that. So we'll go back into Architect. We want to go back into our save method, and now that we have updated the record, we want to get access to it. So in that case, what we can do is go ahead and have preemptive access to the record, and we'll just say record equals form.getRecord. Okay, now that we've updated the record, and this automatically defines that the record that is currently attached to the form is the record that is being updated, we can just call record.save. Inside of here, we can have two different methods for callback that we want to use. So one is the success handler, and the other one is a failure handler. And each of these get back the new copy of the record and the operation. Okay, and on success, we want to call record.commit, meaning that we have a good copy, so it was successfully saved and returned by the server. And on the failure, we would prompt an alert, so we can use XJS singleton class for a message alert, and we can say, oops, please try again later. Okay. So now we'll test. So refresh. And see, Quandary came back because it was not actually saved to the server. So let's just do this, go back, and now we'll type in Quan, and then we'll click save. And I don't want you to save that information. All right, and so now we can see that it was actually successfully committed. Let's just go ahead and test that also with the enabled. So we'll save that. We'll see that the dirty record is going back, and then if we refresh our application, we can see that the data is actually coming back from the server. So we'll actually refresh over here, and we can see that it is updating the last name as well as the enabled property inside of our data set. Alright, so next thing would be to actually create a new record, and so we're going to handle this just slightly different, but we're still going to use the same model. So what we want to do is actually create an empty instance of the model from our grid panel when we do the toolbar new user click event. On new user, we want to go ahead and create a new instance of a record for the user model. So we'll do ext create RESTful admin desktop model user, and we want to go ahead and pass by default enabled set to true, so that this will go ahead and set the active flag for a new user. We'll want to load this record on the form panel. So we'll say when down form dot load record, and then that will give us a brand new record for our new user. So let's go ahead and test this. Okay. So click on new user, and then we'll see that the active flag is actually set. Now by default, if we click on save, this is going to use the model.save as the operation, which is fine because that's going to do a create operation, but we will want to add the model after it's been created on the server to the local store on the client side. So let's go ahead and see how we can test against a new create operation, add that to the store on a save. Because if we go ahead and do this now, so we'll use one of my other colleagues, Mr. Kevin Jackson. Go ahead and click save. And notice that there's nothing that's changed on the grid, but if we actually do a refresh of our application, we'll see that Mr. Jackson actually does exist within the data set. So the record has been created, but it has not been added to the grid. So what we need to do is on a successful create operation, we need to be able to add this record to the store. Otherwise, we're just going to call the record.commit since that record already belongs to the store. And typically when we're working with user records, we want to work on a one-to-one basis. So let's go ahead and go back over here. Inside of our user form save button method, we're going to go ahead and take a look at what the operation action is. We'll say if operation.action equals create, then we want to call ext.getStoreUsers, and then we want to add the record since now it exists on the server. Otherwise, we're going to make the correct assumption that this is actually an update, and we'll call record.commit. Okay, so go back over, make sure we save it. Then we will test. Okay, so go ahead and refresh the application. A new user, my other colleague, Mr. Ron Bailey. We'll go ahead and save this. Now we can see that he has actually been created. If we go back to the data set, we can see that the record also exists there as well. So now we have the functionality of being able to create a new user. We have the ability to be able to edit a user that already exists. So again, that now for Ron, he should be enabled to set defaults. So that works. So the last thing that we need to be able to do is enable the delete functionality and then close out the window just like we do for the save and for the cancel. So the way that we will do that is go back over here and then we'll click on the delete button. We'll add another event binding. Again, it's going to be a click. And we're going to change the name of the function to be delete button click. Go up to the form. So again, we want to save our form equals button dot up to the form panel, and then record. So that would be form dot get record, and then we can call record dot destroy. Now we could have method changed all of this, but you get the idea. And because we're calling the record.destroy, the store is looking at the record properties. It will go ahead and remove the model from the store on a successful destroy or delete, since we're using REST that comes back from the server side. So we go back over here into the design, save the project, and then now we will test to make sure that that works. So go ahead and refresh. And then now if we open up, go ahead and open up generic X, click delete. That removed the record. So we go ahead and close this out. If we refresh, we can see that that record is actually gone, and same thing for up here. So it has been removed from the data set. And then now all we have to do is what we've done in previous places, which is need to get access to the window. We will want to call close. So we will actually do it this way. We will say when equals form dot up window, and then on the destroy we will just go ahead and say when dot close. Okay, save that. We will once again test. Okay, sorry Josh. Deletes the record and closes it off, so we can again refresh, see that the record is actually gone, and we can see that the data set has also been updated. So we have now satisfied all of the requirements for our application. We can now create a new user. We can retrieve and display a list of all of the users showing their active and inactive status, and we can update a user and delete a user. And we can also give them the ability to see the full record and cancel out of it. Okay, so that completes our application. In conclusion, we have used grids for showing multiple rows of data. We've used window modal forms for data entry. We've used buttons inside of toolbars to make for an intuitive UI, and then we've also used the action manipulating the individual rows. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My contact information is here, christopher.rhodes@sencha.com, Twitter @CLRHO. If you want more information and you enjoyed this training, you might want to look into a full training course. You can go to sencha.com/training, or you can email training@sencha.com. Thank you very much, and I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation.